Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of CTLN Opinion Plus. As you know, this is a space to have conversations about the issues and concerns of the Latino community, and and this includes our LGBTQIA family and friends. Today, we're going to be talking about their needs and their concerns, and I am joined today by Max Cisneros who is the Latinx Program Officer for the New Haven Pride Center. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Thanks so much for having me. This is exciting. Being part of like situations that affirm me as a Latino, Latinx, however you want to call it. It's really awesome to do right where we live. So I'm really excited to be with you today.
Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about the New Haven Pride Center?
Sure, yeah. So New Haven Pride Center, it founded in 1996 in New Haven, specifically around the idea of marriage equality. I think the founder said that there were specific incidents where there were folks who were married, whose marriages weren't necessarily acknowledged by the city of New Haven themselves. And we're also talking about undocumented folks who fell in love in New Haven but didn't have all the rights. And so that's really where the center came from. It came from a place to organize to get marriage equality in the state to happen. And that's how the center started. And since then, they hired the first person. It was all volunteer up until 2017. And 2017, they hired their first person. And then just in the last 2 years, we went up to 9 staff members. And so the center really kind of like comes out of a place to provide, specific things like case management, like youth advocacy, you know, like a specific programming. And I'll get to that a little bit more, but also we're doing advocacy work. Just by existing, we do advocacy work, but I like to think that, we have folks on staff who have worked on campaigns, who have worked in politicians' office and public figure offices, and they know how legislatures work, they know how the state senate works, how government works, and so they also advocate in their own capacity. So it's pretty exciting time to be at the Pride Center. So many changes. We're the leading LGBT community center in the state, and we don't say that to boast, but we say that to say that we wish we weren't alone. Like I am the Latinx program officer, and there are 3 other program officers. And part of the idea that we were trying to expand to is, instead of having one central program officer that like directs a whole program, for different folks, we decided to have a youth program officer. We decided to have a trans program officer, a women's program officer, and I am the Latinx, iteration of that. And so part of the idea of the programming structure that way is so we don't leave folks behind, because if we're talking about specific populations that are marginalized in specific ways, then we thought this is the best way how we avoid most things falling through the cracks. And that's how my position came to be. And to this day, I'm going to end on this, but to this day, it's a little sad that I still say that I am the only Latinx program officer in the entire state. So sometimes I like to boast that it's a statewide position, even though it's for the city of New Haven. But the point I'm making with that is that, wouldn't it be great if we had one in every city? Wouldn't it be great if we had one, in every county? And even though we do see Latinx programming happening, it's usually centered around like HIV work, which is important, but it feels like that's not the only Latinx experience out there, right? So I'm really excited to be talking with you about this today.
Um, I really appreciate your work. Then, if you are the only Latinx office leader, so I really appreciate that. Um, as you've mentioned, our experience is very different. Our community is very different. There is a stigma of being gay in the Latin community, where parents fail to accept their children, whether they be children or adult children, for who they are. And there's still this persisting toxicity of machismo. As the Latinx Program Director, how do you address this? And how do we rid ourselves of such a stigma and make it safe for kids and adult children to feel like themselves around their parents?
Thanks so much for asking that. I think that is something that I focus on a lot. And one of the things that I try to do I try to express is, holding space for LGBTQ youth, holding space for folks who understand double discrimination, because the doble discriminación que existe in this community is serious, and it's something that can be really hurtful. Oh, I'm in this country and I may not be accepted. One of my identities isn't accepted in this space. I'm brown and I'm not affirmed as a brown person in this mostly white centered space. And
Mhm.
that's one way I could feel marginalized. But I go, this same identity can go into my home, can go into my church, can go into my, my community network space. And my queerness isn't accepted,
Mhm.
and my brownness is affirmed, my queerness isn't. So no matter where we go, it feels like we're not fully accepted. Not all our identities are celebrated. Entonces, one thing I tried to do is create spaces where our whole identities are accepted. Bring all of yourself, and we will find affirmation. We will find healing. We will find ways to move beyond this, this stigma, this discrimination. So one thing that I do is try to create safe spaces so we can our shared experiences can create empathy. And one of the things that we started to do is like create after I created a couple of safe spaces, in particular, one called Apoyo, which is for LGBTQ youth who speak Spanish. During the pandemic, I was beginning to feel like there were a lot of youth who were staying at home, and they may not necessarily have the same spaces that they had when they were going to school or going to work or going to wherever, where they had those friends they can go to and be affirmed as a queer person. But if they're
Mhm.
home, if they're stuck at home, could you imagine the kind of isolation and the kind of like the kind of stuff that you internalize because you don't get to be affirmed? And so it mattered to me to have apoyo, which is it's twice a month, and it's folks get together. It was on a Saturday because folks weren't coming out, so not that many folks are coming out for the Saturday one because it's getting nice out there, and folks are vaccinated, and so I may have to change the date on that. But the point I was making is that having a space for LGBTQ youth during the darkest days of the pandemic was really important to me, for them to be affirmed and celebrated, and that's where Apoyo came out of. Another one is called Aki. Aki comes from a place from my own stopping grounds. My own, like, way I came to this work is HIV work. I'm an openly HIV positive person, and
Mhm.
and I started doing work in this field, providing HIV tests in Spanish, because not many folks were doing that in Spanish. And so you imagine showing up at a place where you're already very vulnerable, and the person that's testing you for HIV is about to do some incredibly like life changing news, and they don't even speak the language you do. Like, I was trying to stop that. And so that's how I came to this work. And so a key is a space for Spanish speaking HIV positive folks come together and just heal, just talk about being HIV positive in Spanish, which doesn't happen when you're at home, which doesn't happen when you're in school, which doesn't happen when
Mhm.
you're at work, which doesn't happen, in the places that you would want that affirmation. And so those
Mhm.
are the two spaces that I try to like break through the double discrimination that happens in our community. Um,
Is there a way to educate the parents? I'm very blessed that my mother has really come a long way, along with the country, in the sense of when gay marriage was legal, she kind of opened her eyes to it. But I know that hasn't been the case for everybody. So how do we go about educating our community and ending this stigma?
That's a good one. I feel like, and I want to honor your mother, because your mother, much like mine, also uh, didn't worrying about their love wasn't something I ever had to worry about.
Hmm.
Like, thanks to that, I'm able to do this work. I'm like worrying, oh, my mom's going to see me on Facebook. Oh no, I have to worry about that because they affirm me and they celebrate me. And so this is where we are, right? This is you and I being here is a testament to your parents loving you, regardless of what was going on in our lives or who we choose to love. So I think that's pretty awesome. And to answer your question, I think we did a series of workshops specifically for two two groups. One was service providers who interact with LGBTQ youth
Hmm.
and their parents, or families of guardians of LGBTQ youth. And one of the things that we were trying to like get across by doing these was to empathize, like, hey, your kids are going through some seriously traumatic situations, and here's ways to avoid re-traumatizing them. If you really want to understand them, if you really want to help them, if you really want to empathize with their their journeys, then here are some tools. Here are some ways to not worry about so much about what you're saying and if you're saying it right. Because we come from countries where conservadora, it's a rather conservative way of looking at the world, and sometimes we bring those things to this country. We bring those stigmas, we bring those prejudices here when we migrate here, and then we grew up in that environment. So empathy is so important. Just being able to talk with your kids or just listening to your kids, it makes a difference. You might think that you're afraid you're going to say something wrong or offend, and you know what, that may happen, but I think what's more important is folks see you trying. If the LGBTQ youth see you trying, they will be patient. They will appreciate that because that's all they're asking for. They're asking for a space to be affirmed. Entonces, that's what I specifically just off the bat would recommend. Just hold space for the youth. That's huge. But
The New Haven Pride Center also provides a bunch of resources. Unfortunately, LGBTQ youth and even young adults, teenagers, they have a higher chance of being homeless than any other population. Can you tell us a little bit about the resources that the center provides for that?
sure, I think that there are specific resources outside of. No, we have a case management service, and the case management service is something I refer a lot of folks to because it covers so much ground. And that's specifically with our case manager's name is Juan Carlos Soto. Juan Carlos Soto used to work at Planned Parenthood, and while he worked at Planned Parenthood in New Haven, he also advocated in the state legislature. He was also advocating in City Hall of New Haven. He was also advocating for not just the LGBTQ, not just for women's reproductive rights, but also the LGBTQ community. And so, in many ways, him becoming the case manager covers so much ground. And in this work, it's so important that the last 10 years I've been working in the nonprofit field and referring folks to a place that where it's going to be a successful referral, referring
Mhm.
folks to who need help to where it's going to be a place where they can go, they will be heard, they will be affirmed, and also not re-traumatized, which is really important in this field, is so significant. It's so special and it's so useful. So that's why when I tell folks to go see Juan Carlos for any need in which that I may not necessarily know where they can get that, I know that Juan Carlos will handle it really well. So it just makes a huge difference. And he speaks Spanish. So that makes a big difference for folks to know that you can go here and you won't get the kind of treatment that sometimes you get in other places. There's cultural competency here, there's understanding here, there's Spanish speakers here. And so that makes a big difference when it comes to, understanding the kind of services that are available for folks. When it comes to homelessness, specifically what I would say is I worked at a shelter in Norwalk, right, for about a year during the pandemic. And one thing I noticed is just how underserved the LGBTQ community is in these spaces. So a lot of the reason why I came out to New Haven to do this work is because I thought, all right, if I show up in a Latinx space and work from here, how can I ensure that the folks who are homeless here, instead of going to a homeless shelter to help house folks who are LGBT Latinx, I wasn't having much luck there. So how about I start from a Latinx space and from there try to see what I can do to grow a bigger resource center for folks to be able to find housing, even if it isn't directly in one spot. So I don't know if that to answer your question specifically is homelessness is a huge issue in this community, and it's not just because staff in homeless shelters may not necessarily see as a need. It is also something where residents themselves, fellow homeless residents, may not necessarily always provide the most healing space for LGBTQ folks, especially if they're youth. So that's something that we seriously need to address, within the homeless shelter networks, specifically.
We only have a few minutes left,
Oh,
but I have one last question.
go ahead.
Um, we have seen a series of anti-trans bills. I'm hoping that this administration will rectify this, hopefully. But in your opinion, what does comprehensive LGBTQIA legislation look like?
Inclusion is so important to me. Having folks at the table who are making the decisions about how these laws sound, how the language is put together, how the process is, and how it's like like rubber hitting the road, how on the ground, how do these laws work? You're so right to mention this, because what we're seeing right now is there are over like 120 anti-LGBTQ bills making their way through state legislatures right now throughout the country. About 65 of them are directly attacking trans youth, usually centered around Title IX, Title IX issues, in regards to sports and things of that nature. So, and these folks who are criminalizing trans bodies and criminalizing trans youth, like kids who want to play sports, man. Like, that's something that you want to focus on right now, but that is what's happening. And out of all the other states, Connecticut is probably one of the best states to be in, because we have a caucus in the state legislature, folks who are fighting every time trans bills come up. Juan Carlos Soto at the Pride Center can speak a little bit more specifically about that, because he works with them. But also, I just want to say that Connecticut is probably one of the best states to understand what your rights are as far as LGBTQ issues, specifically around trans youth. So the things that we can do is we can support the legislatures, the folks who are actually on the ground trying to get these bills stopped, or at least the ones that are trying to get the bills that are out there, making it easier for folks in the community to be able to get not just their needs met, but also not be messed with so much from these anti-trans bills that are making it all over right now. And that also it gets to trans visibility too. When we're talking about trans visibility, one of the things that we do at the Pride Center is we really try to affirm trans spaces for folks wherever they are. 2 weeks ago, we had a trans indigenous conversation with a woman from Bolivia who spoke Quechua, and she spoke Quechua to us. And she said, she was talking about high level trans theory in Quechua. Like, could you imagine folks coming to this country after not hearing Quechua and then suddenly hearing it online from a trans woman in Bolivia, So I think that's just such affirming stuff. So trans visibility has a lot to do with it, but also supporting the folks who are on the ground fighting these bills and promoting the ones that support and celebrate trans youth.
Well, thank you for joining us, Max. This has been really informative. I really appreciate this conversation. I think there needs to be more of it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. And this is something I think that I'd like to see more of. Like I said, I don't like saying I'm the only Latinx program officer in the state. I really want to stop saying that. So it's up to the rest of the state to make sure that that I stop saying that sometime in the future. So thank you so much for this invitation. It really means a lot to me that that you elevate this conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Tune in next week for another episode. And thank you again to Max and the New Haven Pride Center for joining us. For more information about the resources discussed in this interview, check out the web story. Check out our web story that accompanies this video at ctlatinonews.com. And don't forget to follow us on all of our social media handles, on Twitter at CT Latino News and Instagram at CT_Latino News. I'm Samani Campos with CTLN Opinion Plus. Thanks for joining us.